French poetic realism is a film movement that first began in France in the 1930s. In 1920s, the entirety of the film industry in France was controlled by two major film companies, Pathé Frères and Gaumont. However, around this exact same time, the country was faced with World War II, which led to bankruptcy in these two companies. While the tanking of the only two major film companies in France seemed a terrible thing, it made room for smaller film companies to emerge, which led to the birth of French poetic realism, a movement that, as said by Bob Dylan, is easy to look at but hard to define. There are many basic characteristics of this film movement, including focus on working-class characters, theme of doomed love, blending of comedy and tragedy, long shots or long takes, narratives that function as critiques to society, black and white, a rejection of happy endings, sexist films, natural but important lighting, and authentic costumes and designs. Sound was another notable accomplishment that led to the success of this particular movement. Up until this point in French cinema history, movies had been silent. However, the start of poetic realism began at the start of the era of sound, which allowed for the integration of poetic, non-narrative innovations. This film movement was able to blend the aesthetic concerns associated with earlier film movements with the traditional movie realism so to display a socially conscious perspective while remaining available to a wide and varying audience. The movement of French poetic realism was heavily influenced by both Impressionism and Surrealism. French Impressionism was a movement in France in all forms of art in the 1860s that was characterized by its concern of capturing an experience or feeling rather than achieving an accurate depiction of something. Surrealism was a movement based on the more creative and unreal spectrum. This 20th century movement sought to release creative potential and explore the imagination and unknown. Both of these movements helped to influence the beginning of French poetic realism. Many consider the title of this movement, Poetic Realism, to be oxymoronic, because poetry is often thought of being the opposite of realism. Poetry is not usually expressed in a straightforward way, but often through the use of metaphors and other figurative language that masks the true meaning of it, while realism is very straightforward. So how can poetic realism exist? Simply put, French poetic realism synthesizes these two extremes to combine at a happy medium, utilizing new poetic styles found in Impressionism and Surrealism, and merges it with realistic style filmmaking. Some of the most influential filmmakers of all time were involved in this movement, including Jean Vigo. Many consider Jean Vigo's poetic realist film, La Talente, one of the most beautiful films ever made. Even Henry Langlois, one of the most important figures in filmmaking history, states, "If cinema is an art of sleep, there is only one man who holds the key to dreams, Jean Vigo." La Talente is considered to be a prime example of French poetic realism style. Jonathan Rosenbaum, an American film critic, writes that the film La Talente is a majorly influential film that nobody had come close to matching. Jean Renoir is another notable person involved in the poetic realist movement and is said to be the most famous and critically renowned of all of the great French directors. His film, The Rules of the Game, was quite popular both during and after the era of French poetic realism. This film focuses on social issues and therefore was banned by the French government shortly after its release. While this film was banned, it did exemplify the traits of poetic realism, such as the blending of comedy and tragedy, the use of cinematic techniques to provide social commentary, and the use of long shots and long takes. This film movement started its decline after the start of World War II. After France declared war on Germany, Germany retaliated by banning all French films. Most of the French directors and filmmakers were drafted into the war or decided to flee the country when Germany invaded, which officially ended the movement of French poetic realism. While the movement didn't last long due to wars, it was very influential in the world of film.